Hi, today I thought I would show you how to do what I call my All Machine Quilt Binding with Faux Piping. The first thing you need to do is measure the perimeter of your quilt so that you're going to make sure that you have enough strips that will equal the perimeter of your quilt, and then add some to that. You want to make sure you have extra. You're going to need 2 fabric strips. I like to sew my binding at 1/4 inch, so I'm going to cut my strips at 1 inch and 1 1/4 inch. Of course, you can sew your binding at any width you want. If you want to sew it at 1/2 inch or more, what you need is the formula. You're going to take 3 times the depth that you want to sew the binding on, plus 1/4 inch. That will be the first strip that you cut. The second strip is the same, plus 1/4 inch. So it would be 1 inch and 1 1/4 inch for 1/4 inch binding. So you cut your strips, and then you have to join them together, which I'm going to show you at my sewing machine. Okay, so we've taken those strips, and you're going to take them and put them at right angles to each other, right sides together, and then you're going to put them under the sewing machine, and you're going to sew from corner to corner straight across. And you're going to repeat that for the other set of strips that you have. And you can chain piece them if you want, especially if you're doing the whole perimeter of the quilt. Again, right sides together, right angles to each other, and sew from corner to corner. Now you're going to take them to the ironing board. Okay, so now you press these seams open, and you trim off the tails. Do that to the other one as well. You sew them at an angle like this to minimize the bulk while we're moving on to making the rest of the binding. Okay, now we need to sew these 2 strips together, right sides together at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, right sides together, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Keep your raw edges lined up, and sew the whole length of the strip. Now we take it back to the ironing board. We want to press the seam toward the smaller piece of fabric. We want to make sure that you don't have any extra bumps or whatever here. You want to make sure it's going to lay nice and flat, and that that seam is going in the right direction. Now you have to press it wrong sides together, aligning your raw edges, and you'll see that the piping starts to show up on the edges. There you go. Now it's time to attach it to the quilt. Okay, you want to make sure you start in the middle of a side, and you want to leave a long tail when you start to sew. You're going to line up your raw edges of the binding with the raw edge of the quilt, and in my case we're going to be sewing at 1/4 inch depth. I have my 1/4 inch foot on here. We're attaching the binding to the wrong side of the quilt. We want to make sure that the solid color of the piping or the binding is up, that you can't see the piping. Okay, as we get near the corner, you're going to want to stop sewing 1/4 of an inch away from the next side. If you were sewing a 1/2 inch binding, you would stop a 1/2 inch away from the edge. I like to cut my thread and take the quilt out so that I can turn it. And now to do the corner, you're going to fold your binding strip straight up at 90 degrees angles and then straight down. You want to try and align the fold with the top edge of the quilt and the raw edges here. And you're going to start sewing 1/4 inch down and 1/4 inch in, so as not to catch that folded part of the binding. And now you sew the next side, and you repeat this until you get done with your 4th corner. And I'll show you what we do when we get back to the last side. Alright, I finally made it around. I finished the last corner of the quilt over there. This is where we started, and this is what I've left myself room to work with. So now you're going to fold this, the beginning part of the binding, back on itself, any place. Give yourself a little room here, wiggle room. And then you're going to bring the other piece of the end of the binding up, and you're going to fold it back so that the two folds match. Now comes the hard part, where you're going to have to get brave and cut it. You need to measure this. In my case, the width of the binding itself is 1 3/4 inches. So I'm going to measure back from the end side of the binding back 1 3/4 inches. 1 3/4 inches, and I'm going to cut. And I'm also going to cut right here where this piece was folded at. And there's my 2 ends of the binding. Now you open up your ends of the bindings. You're going to draw a line on the end piece from 1 3/4 inches to the corner, because you need to know where it intersects on that seam. So you were like this, you opened it up, and you open up this side as well. Now you want to put right sides together, so you turn this one back on itself, you leave this one alone, right sides together, and you put them at right angles, line it up the corners. And this is the first time we're going to use some pins. We're going to put a pin in this corner to hold it together. We're going to put a pin in this corner. And we're going to put a pin where the line crosses the seam, and it's got to come out on the seam on the other piece. So you want to kind of finagle until you get that to work. Sort of like that. Now you're going to take it to your sewing machine, and we're going to sew from the corner to the corner. So here again, we're going to sew from the corner to the corner, and we're going to try and cross that seam line where our stitch line. Now you take the pins out and you lay it back down to make sure that you didn't get it all twisted around and that it's going to lay flat along the quilt. And then you look to see whether your intersection here is in pretty good shape. That's a little messy, but I'm going to let it go since it's a scrap quilt. Then you can press these seams open if you want. I just kind of hand press them and clip it back. And then we finish sewing the binding to the back of the quilt. Now you flip the quilt to the front, and you're going to be wrapping the binding around the edge and back to the front. This is where you want your thread colors to match. You're going to be sewing in the ditch, so you want a thread color that's coordinating here, and you're going to want your bobbin thread to coordinate with your backing fabric. You're going to be sewing at 1/4 inch depth, which means you should be able to line up the edge of your foot again with the edge of the fabric and sew in the ditch. I stop with the needle down so the quilt doesn't move on me. Just keep sewing at 1/4 inch until your needle gets even with this stitch line on the next side. Now we're going to go down the other side of the quilt. So we lay that flat and we fold this over so it makes a nice point right there. And then we put it underneath the sewing machine, and we're going to start sewing from right there and continue on down this side. And then you would just continue sewing like that around all 4 corners, and then you'll be done. I'm going to stop here and show you what it looks like on the back. So here's your mitered corner. Here's your stitching in the ditch, and that's what it looks like on the back. I hope that helps.